The toothbrush blade caught Marconi in the ribs instead of the kidney, a mistake that cost Carlos Machete Hernandez his life and the other two their souls. Vinny moved like water, the way his grandfather taught him in the back room of Torino's restaurant 60 years ago. Not fast, but fluid. He spun into the thrust, letting Hernandez's momentum carry the weapon past his vital organs, then grabbed the man's wrist with hands that still remembered how to break bones despite 18 months of relative softness. The snap echoed off the laundry room's concrete walls like a gunshot. Hernandez screamed. The toothbrush clattered to the floor. But Vinny wasn't done. Couldn't be done, not with 2 more sets of hands reaching for him. Tommy Southside Ricci came from the left, no weapon, just meaty fists that had crushed skulls in Detroit. Marcus Washington flanked right, gripping a sock filled with batteries like a medieval mace. This was the moment that separated the living from the dead in ADX Florence. 3 younger men, all serving life sentences with nothing to lose, versus a 64-year-old rat who'd testified against the most feared crime boss in American history. The smart money should have been on the young wolves. Vinny Cards had never been interested in smart money. He dealt in certainties. He drove his elbow into Ricci's solar plexus, feeling ribs crack, then ducked Washington's improvised weapon and came up with Hernandez's fallen toothbrush. The blade, still warm with his own blood, found the soft spot beneath Washington's jaw. Not deep enough to kill. Vinny wasn't stupid enough to commit murder 18 months from freedom, but deep enough to send a message that would echo through every cell block. Washington dropped like a sack of cement. The whole thing took 23 seconds. Vinny knew because he'd been counting since the first thrust, the same way he'd counted cards at illegal poker games from Brooklyn to Miami Beach. Time was just another currency to be managed, another edge to be pressed. Ricci was on his knees, gasping for air through a collapsed lung. Hernandez cradled his shattered wrist against his chest, whimpering. Washington bled onto the industrial washing machines while pressing his hand to his throat. Vinny straightened his orange jumpsuit and resumed folding laundry. "You tell whoever sent you," he said without looking at the 3 broken men, "that Vincent Marconi doesn't die easy. And the next crew they send better bring more than homemade shivs and wishful thinking." The guards found them 4 minutes later, exactly when Vinny knew they would. Officer Reynolds, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything ADX Florence could dish out, took one look at the scene and reached for his radio with hands that weren't quite steady. Medical emergency in laundry block C. 3 inmates down. Repeat, 3 inmates down. What happened here, Marconi? Reynolds kept his weapon drawn but didn't point it. Smart man. He understood that Vinny could have killed all 3 if he'd wanted to. "Workplace accident," Vinny replied, folding another jumpsuit with the precision of a man who'd once pressed suits for Gotti's court appearances. Dangerous place, the laundry, all these machines, slippery floors. Man's got to be careful. Reynolds looked at Hernandez, then Washington, then Ricci. 3 of the most violent inmates in federal custody, all neutralized by a senior citizen who'd spent more time in courtrooms than prison yards over the past 2 years. "Accident," Reynolds repeated. "Terrible shame," Vinny agreed. "Hope they recover fully." The medical team arrived with stretchers and questions nobody would answer. In ADX Florence, silence was the only currency that mattered more than violence, and everyone understood the exchange rate. As they wheeled out the casualties, Vinny caught Reynolds studying him with new eyes. The officer had read the files, knew about the testimony, the cooperation agreement, the protective custody status. But files didn't capture everything. They didn't explain how a federal witness could command respect through blood and broken bones, or why 3 life sentence inmates would risk solitary confinement for a shot at killing one old man. "Marconi," Reynolds said as the medical team disappeared down the corridor. "Yeah? You might want to watch your back extra careful from now on." Vinny looked up from the laundry basket, his pale blue eyes holding decades of secrets that would never see daylight. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "I've been watching my back since before you were born. The only difference is, now I know exactly who's stupid enough to try and stab it." Reynolds holstered his weapon and walked away, leaving Vinny alone with the bloodstains and the growing certainty that someone with serious juice wanted him dead before his release date. Someone who commanded enough respect to convince 3 lifers to risk everything for a chance at the man who'd brought down John Gotti. The question wasn't who wanted him dead. In his line of work, That list was longer than a federal sentencing guideline. The question was why now, and why so desperately that they'd risk exposing their hand in broad daylight. Vincent Marconi folded the last jumpsuit and began to plan. The concrete walls of Cell Block 7 held silence like a tomb, broken only by the mechanical wheeze of the ventilation system and the distant echo of steel doors slamming shut. Vinny sat on his narrow bunk, studying the small photograph he kept pressed between the pages of a worn copy of The Art of War, the only personal item the federal marshals had allowed him to keep when they delivered him to ADX Florence 18 months ago. The photo showed a 7-year-old boy with dark eyes and Vinny's own stubborn chin, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while clutching a baseball glove nearly as big as his torso. Little Anthony Marconi, his daughter Sophia's kid. His grandson. The reason Vinny had broken the sacred code that had governed his life for 6 decades. Never rat. Never cooperate. Never break omerta. But leukemia didn't respect codes, and 7-year-old boys didn't understand why their grandfather couldn't visit them in the hospital because he was too busy running numbers and collecting debts for John Gotti's crime family. The experimental treatment at Sloan Kettering cost money, real money, the kind that required federal witness protection and a cooperation agreement that had made Vinny's name poison from Brooklyn to Vegas. He traced the boy's face with one finger, careful not to smudge the already fading image. The cut on his ribs burned with each breath, a fresh reminder that his past wasn't finished with him yet. 3 men had tried to kill him today, and they wouldn't be the last. Someone powerful wanted him dead, someone with enough reach to coordinate hits inside the most secure prison in America. The cell door's observation slots scraped open, then closed. Guard check. Vinny didn't look up. He'd learned to read the rhythm of this place the way he'd once read the rhythm of illegal poker games. Every sound had meaning, every pattern told a story. ADX Florence was a machine built to crush men's spirits through isolation and routine, but Vinny had survived worse. He'd survived 40 years in the Gambino family, where paranoia was a survival skill and trust was a luxury that got you killed. Hey, Marconi. The voice came from the cell next door, filtered through the steel and concrete. Eddie the Pipe Torino, a Lucchese family soldier who'd been caught running a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation through offshore casinos. Eddie had been friendly since Vinny's arrival, sharing commissary items and prison intelligence. Too friendly, maybe. In Vinny's experience, friendship in places like this usually came with a price. What's the word, Eddie? Heard you had some excitement in the laundry today. Vinny set the photograph aside and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Someone had carved the words "fuck the feds" into the concrete above his head, probably with a smuggled blade similar to the one that had opened his ribs. The letters were precise, methodical. Whoever had done it had taken their time, turned rage into art. Just another day in paradise, he replied. Those 3 won't be back anytime soon. Word is Hernandez needs surgery on that wrist. Accidents happen. Eddie laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Yeah, well, might want to watch yourself at chow tomorrow. People are talking. The observation slot scraped open again. This time it stayed open longer, 5 seconds instead of the usual 2. Vinny filed the information away. Everything meant something in this place. A guard who lingered too long at your door. An inmate who asked too many questions. A coordinated attack that happened exactly when the security cameras were down for their weekly maintenance. Someone had inside help. Someone who knew Vinny's schedule, his habits, his weaknesses. After Eddie's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, Vinny pulled out a small notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress. Officially, it contained his daily reflections, part of the rehabilitation program that looked good on federal review boards. Unofficially, it held something far more valuable, a detailed map of every inmate, guard, and staff member at ADX Florence. Their connections, their weaknesses, their secrets. Carlos Hernandez, Sinaloa cartel money man, 3 kids in Tijuana, mother dying of cancer. Tommy Ricci, Detroit muscle, gambling debts to the Chicago outfit. Sister works as a federal prosecutor in Michigan. Marcus Washington, D.C., drug lord, rumored FBI informant before his conviction, keeps photos of his daughter hidden in his cell. 3 men with nothing in common except life sentences and the willingness to risk everything for a shot at Vinny cards. Someone had found their pressure points, promised them something worth dying for. Money for their families, maybe. Protection for loved ones. Or threats dire enough to make a suicide mission seem like the better option. Vinny clicked his pen and added a new entry. Someone inside wants me dead before release. Question: who has access? Who benefits? Who's pulling strings? He closed the notebook and retrieved the photograph of his grandson. In 6 months, he'd walk out of this concrete tomb a free man. He'd kept his end of the cooperation agreement, testified against Gotti and 36 other made men, helped the feds dismantle one of the most powerful crime families in New York history, all for a 7-year-old boy with his grandfather's eyes and his mother's gentle heart, all for the chance to watch little Anthony grow up in a world where cancer was just another fight to be won. Vinny pressed the photo against his chest and closed his eyes, planning his next move in a game where the stakes were measured not in money or territory, but in the promise he'd made to a dying child. Someone wanted him dead. They'd learn why that was a mistake. The letter arrived at 0800 hours sharp, delivered by Officer Martinez during the morning mail call. Vinny knew something was wrong the moment he saw the federal envelope, too crisp, too official, bearing the seal of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. His cooperation agreement had been finalized 18 months ago, his testimony sealed, his debriefings complete. There was no reason for the feds to contact him now, 6 months before his release. Vinny's hands remained steady as he tore open the envelope, but his chest tightened around the fresh wound from yesterday's attack. The letterhead confirmed his worst fears: Office of the United States Attorney, Criminal Division, Organized Crime Task Force, Mr. Marconi. We regret to inform you that certain discrepancies have come to light regarding your cooperation agreement dated March 15, 2022. Specifically, questions have arisen concerning the accuracy of your testimony regarding the whereabouts and activities of your immediate family members during the relevant time periods. We have recently discovered that your grandson, Anthony Marconi, age 7, died of acute lymphoblastic leukemia on September 18, 2021, 6 months before your initial proffer session and 7 months before you entered into your cooperation agreement with this office. Given that your cooperation was predicated on providing for your grandson's medical treatment, we are conducting a review of your agreement and testimony for potential fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice. You will be contacted by Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Kellerman within 72 hours to discuss these developments. We strongly advise you to obtain legal counsel. Sincerely, James Morrison, Chief, Organized Crime Strike Force. The letter slipped from Vinny's fingers and fluttered to the concrete floor like a dying bird. Anthony was dead, had been dead for 2 years. The photograph he'd pressed against his chest last night. The face he'd memorized in every sleepless hour since arriving at ADX Florence. The smile that had given him strength through 18 months of concrete and steel. All of it a lie, a carefully constructed fiction that had somehow sustained him through the darkest period of his life. Vinny's legs buckled. He collapsed onto his bunk, the springs groaning under his weight, and stared at the letter on the floor. The words blurred together, but certain phrases burned themselves into his vision. Died of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. 6 months before. Fraud, perjury, obstruction. The timeline crashed over him like a tidal wave. September 2021, Anthony dies. March 2022, Vinny makes his deal with the feds, believing he's saving his grandson's life. The experimental treatment at Sloan Kettering, the witness protection, the cooperation agreement that had turned him into a dead man walking among his own people, all for a child who was already in the ground. His daughter Sophia's voice echoed from their last phone call before his arrest. "Papa, I can't talk about this over the phone. Just know that everything I told you about Anthony, I had my reasons." He'd assumed she meant the cancer, the treatment, the desperate need for money that only cooperation could provide. She'd been telling him Anthony was dead, and he'd been too consumed with his own guilt to hear it. The cell walls seemed to close in around him. Every breath felt like drowning. For 18 months he'd endured the hatred of men like Eddie Torino, the constant threat of violence, the suffocating isolation of protective custody. He'd broken omerta, the sacred code of silence that had governed 3 generations of Marconis. He'd testified against John Gotti, sending the most powerful crime boss in America to die behind bars. For nothing. For a ghost. For a little boy whose funeral he'd missed while sitting in a federal detention center, planning testimony that would destroy everything he'd ever believed in. Vinny picked up the photograph from where it had fallen beside his bunk. Anthony's gap-toothed grin mocked him now. When had this picture been taken? Before the cancer, after the diagnosis, but before the end. Had Sophia known her son was dying when she'd sent this final image to her father? The observation slot scraped open. Through the blur of his vision, Vinny saw Martinez's eyes studying him with professional concern. "Everything all right in there, Marconi?" Vinny cleared his throat, tasting copper and betrayal. "Just fine, officer." The slot closed, but Vinny knew Martinez would be watching more carefully now. A federal witness having a breakdown 6 months before release was the kind of situation that generated paperwork and questions. Questions that might lead to the same conclusion the Justice Department had reached. Vincent Marconi had been played from the beginning. The coordinated hit in the laundry made perfect sense now. Someone had known the truth about Anthony all along. Someone had waited for Vinny to dig himself deeper into cooperation, to burn every bridge and destroy every relationship before revealing that his sacrifice had been meaningless. Someone who wanted him to know he'd betrayed his family, his code, and his entire life for a dead child. Someone who understood that the cruelest revenge wasn't death. It was the knowledge that everything you'd suffered for had been a lie. Vinny folded the letter carefully and slipped it between the pages of The Art of War, right next to Anthony's photograph. The game had changed completely, and Vincent "Vinny" Cards Marconi was about to show them what a man with nothing left to lose could accomplish. The first instinct was to burn everything. The letter, the photograph, the cooperation agreement he'd memorized word by word. Vinny sat motionless for 20 minutes after Martinez's eyes disappeared from the observation slot, his mind cycling through decades of survival protocols. When cornered, assess your assets. When betrayed, trust no one. When facing impossible odds, change the game entirely. But this wasn't a corner he could fight his way out of. This was a grave he'd dug himself, one shovelful of testimony at a time. "Yo, Marconi." Eddie's voice drifted through the steel wall. "You got mail from your lawyer or something? You been quiet since chow." Vinny forced his voice steady. "Nothing important." "Yeah, well, you might want to pay attention to what's happening around here. Word is spreading about yesterday. Some people are asking questions about who you really are." The words carried weight that Eddie probably didn't intend. Who you really are. Not who Vinny had been. A made man who'd run Gotti's books for 15 years, who'd earned his nickname by reading tells at high-stakes games, who'd commanded respect from Brooklyn to Atlantic City. Who he really was. A broken old man who'd testified against his own family for a dead child. "Let them ask," Vinny replied, but his hands were trembling. 3 hours passed before he could bring himself to pull out his notebook. His detailed map of ADX Florence suddenly felt childish, like a kid playing spy games. What good was intelligence when the fundamental premise of your existence was a lie? He'd been planning moves in a chess game while someone else had been playing an entirely different sport. The photographs hidden in his cell. He pulled them out now, studying each one with fresh eyes. Anthony at Christmas, grinning beside a tree. Anthony in a hospital bed, pale but smiling. Anthony's first day of school. When had that boy become a ghost? Had Vinny been looking at pictures of a corpse all this time, building hope around images of a child already rotting in Queen's soil? His chest wound burned as he reached for the hidden compartment behind his sink. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was something he'd sworn never to use, a piece of the shiv that had opened his ribs yesterday. He'd palmed it during the fight, insurance against future attacks. Now he held it up to the fluorescent light, watching steel catch and reflect his distorted image. For a moment, just a moment, the blade felt like absolution. The observation slot scraped open again. This time it was Officer Reynolds, the veteran who'd found the aftermath in the laundry. His eyes locked onto Vinny's face with the practiced assessment of a man who'd talked dozens of inmates away from permanent solutions to temporary problems. "Marconi, step away from whatever you're holding." Vinny looked down at his hands, surprised to find the blade still there. When had he raised it? When had his survival instincts transformed into something darker? He set the metal fragment on his bunk with deliberate care. "Just cleaning," he said. "Uh-huh." You want to talk about that mail you got this morning? Nothing to talk about. Reynolds was quiet for 30 seconds, studying Vinny through the narrow slot. You know, I've been doing this job for 20 years. Seen men get letters that change everything. Bad news from home, legal problems, family stuff. His voice carried surprising gentleness. Whatever's in that letter, there's ways to handle it that don't involve getting yourself killed or doing something stupid. Vinny almost laughed. Ways to handle it. Like there was a protocol for discovering that your entire moral collapse had been orchestrated by people who knew your grandson was already dead. Like there was a procedure for processing 18 months of meaningless suffering. I appreciate the concern, officer. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's given up. And given up men in federal prison don't usually last long enough to see their release dates. After Reynolds moved on, Vinny lay on his bunk and stared at the carved words above his head. Fuck the feds. Whoever had spent hours etching those letters into concrete had possessed something Vinny envied now. Certainty. Clear enemies. Obvious targets for rage. Vinny's enemies were ghosts. The people who'd manipulated him wore federal badges and carried cooperation agreements. They'd used his love for a dead child like a weapon, turning his greatest weakness into their greatest advantage. But as darkness settled over cell block 7, as Eddie's snoring filtered through the walls and the night guards began their rounds, something crystallized in Vinny's mind. The rage was still there, white-hot and consuming. The betrayal burned like acid in his chest. But underneath it all, his old instincts were stirring. Someone had played him perfectly for 2 years. Time to return the favor. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The revelation about Anthony haunted Vinny through the night, but by morning, his old instincts had crystallized into something harder than grief. Someone had orchestrated this entire charade, and Vincent Vinny Card's Marconi didn't get played twice. He started with the commissary list, a seemingly innocuous document that revealed more than most inmates realized. Every purchase, every transaction, every favor traded for cigarettes or candy bars. The 3 men who'd attacked him had all received mysterious deposits in their accounts 2 weeks before the hit. Clean money, processed through official channels, which meant someone with federal access had funded his assassination attempt. Vinny's hands moved with practiced precision as he cross-referenced dates with guard schedules, meal rotations, and maintenance windows. The attack had been timed perfectly for the laundry's camera blind spot, knowledge that only came from inside the system. But it was the medical records that broke everything open. Officer Martinez made his routine rounds at 1,400 hours, delivering the weekly batch of correspondence. Buried among legal documents and court transcripts was a misfiled medical report, Anthony's oncology records from Sloan Kettering, dated September 2021. The bureaucratic error felt deliberate, like someone wanted Vinny to see exactly how his grandson had died. Patient expired 347 hours following complications from chemotherapy-induced sepsis. Father, Michael Marconi, incarcerated. Emergency contact, Sophia Marconi, mother. Patient had expressed desire to see grandfather Vincent Marconi prior to death. Request denied due to federal custody status. The words hit him like physical blows. Anthony had asked for him. In those final hours, as a 7-year-old boy fought for breath in a sterile hospital room, he'd wanted his grandfather. And Vinny had been sitting in a federal holding cell, still believing his cooperation could save the child's life. His daughter Sophia had lied to him for 6 months, feeding him false hope while her son rotted in the ground. But why? Why maintain the fiction that had driven Vinny to betray everything he'd ever believed in? The answer came from an unexpected source. Marconi. Eddie's voice carried a new tension. You got visitors tomorrow. Legal visit. Vinny set down the medical records, his mind racing. No one had scheduled a legal visit. His court-appointed attorney had closed his case 18 months ago, and Vinny had refused all contact with family members since entering ADX Florence. Who's coming? Didn't say. But word is it's not good news. And word is also that certain people have been asking about your cooperation agreement. Specifically what you knew and when you knew it. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. Someone had been watching Vinny's every move, waiting for him to discover the truth about Anthony. The misfiled medical records, the letter from the Justice Department, even the coordinated attack in the laundry. All of it designed to push him toward a specific realization. He'd been set up from the beginning, but not by the feds, by his own family. Vinny pulled out his hidden notebook and began connecting dots that had been invisible until now. Sophia's phone calls had stopped 3 months after his arrival at ADX Florence, exactly when she would have been certain he'd committed fully to cooperation. His son-in-law Michael's arrest had preceded Vinny's own by exactly 2 weeks, creating the desperation that made cooperation seem like the only option. Even the cancer diagnosis timing felt orchestrated, coming just as federal prosecutors needed leverage against the Gambino family's most valuable accountant. Someone had sacrificed Anthony to create the perfect weapon against Vincent Marconi. And when that weapon had served its purpose, they'd orchestrated this revelation to destroy him completely. The observation slot scraped open. Reynolds again, his eyes scanning the cell with professional paranoia. "Everything all right in there? You missed evening chow? Lost track of time." "Uh-huh. Listen, Marconi, I've seen that look before. Men who figured something out they wish they hadn't. Whatever you're planning, remember where you are. This place has a way of making bad decisions feel necessary." After Reynolds moved on, Vinny stood and pressed his face against the narrow window that looked out over the Colorado mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks, his grandson's grave was growing cold while the people who'd killed him enjoyed federal protection. Somewhere, his daughter Sophia was living with secrets that had cost Vinny everything. The legal visit tomorrow would bring answers, but Vinny already knew enough. He'd been betrayed not just by the Justice Department, but by his own blood. Anthony's death hadn't been tragedy. It had been murder by negligence, orchestrated by people who needed Vinny broken and desperate. As darkness settled over Cell Block 7 again, Vinny made his decision. He'd spent 40 years reading people like poker hands, and now he could see the cards that had been hidden from him. The game wasn't just beginning, it was entering its final phase. And Vincent "Vinny" Cards Marconi had never lost when everything was on the table. The legal visit room at ADX Florence felt like a tomb. Concrete walls, bulletproof glass, and the kind of silence that made every heartbeat echo. Vinny sat in shackles, waiting for whoever had orchestrated this meeting, when the door opened and his world collapsed completely. Sophia walked in. His daughter looked older, harder around the edges, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of federal money. But it was her eyes that destroyed him, cold, calculating, devoid of the grief a mother should carry for her dead son. "Hello, Papa." Vinny's voice caught in his throat. "You let me believe he was alive. I let you believe what you needed to believe." Sophia sat across from him with the practiced composure of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "Anthony died in September 2021. You made your cooperation deal in March 2022. Do the math. The timeline hit him like a physical blow. You used your own son's death to manipulate me. I used your love for him to save both our lives." Sophia opened a legal folder, her movements clinical. "You think the Justice Department came to you by accident? You think they just happened to need testimony against Gotti right when Anthony got sick?" Vinny stared at his daughter, this stranger wearing Sophia's face, and felt 30 years of certainties crumble. "You've been working with them since 2019, long before Anthony's diagnosis, long before your arrest." Her voice carried no emotion, no hint of the woman who'd once called him crying about medical bills and experimental treatments. "The Torino family put a contract on both of us after they discovered your skimming operation. The only way to survive was federal protection." "My skimming operation? The books you kept for Gotti weren't just records, Papa. They were evidence. And when Eddie's father realized how much detail you documented, how many crimes you could prove, we became liabilities. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. You created Anthony's medical emergency to give me a reason to cooperate. I gave you a reason to live." Sophia leaned forward, and for a moment he saw a flash of something that might have been genuine emotion. "You would have taken a bullet rather than break Omerta. But for Anthony, for your grandson, you'd burn the whole world down." Vinny's hands trembled against his shackles. "He asked for me. In the hospital, before he died, Anthony asked for me. He did." This admission carried the first crack in Sophia's armor. "And I told him you were coming. I told him Grandpa was fighting to save him, that everything was going to be okay, while you knew I was in federal custody, while I knew his grandfather's testimony was the only thing keeping his mother alive. Sophia's composure finally shattered. You think this was easy? You think watching my son die while lying to both of you was some kind of game? Then why? The words exploded from Vinny's chest. Why continue the lie? Why let me suffer for 18 months thinking he was still alive? Because the moment you learned the truth, your cooperation became worthless. The feds needed you desperate, not devastated. They needed Vincent Marconi, the grandfather, not Vincent Marconi, the grieving man with nothing left to lose. Vinny saw it all now, the careful orchestration, the psychological manipulation, the way his own love had been weaponized against him. But there was something else, something in Sophia's eyes that suggested another layer to this betrayal. There's more. Papa, there's more. You wouldn't be here, wouldn't risk this meeting unless something had changed. Sophia glanced toward the door, then back to her father. Eddie Torino knows the truth about Anthony, about my cooperation, about everything. The words hit Vinny like ice water. Eddie, the man in the next cell, the one who'd been asking questions, making observations, getting too close to secrets that should have died with a 7-year-old boy. How long has he known? Since yesterday. Someone in the Justice Department leaked your file as leverage in Eddie's own cooperation negotiations. Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper. He's been feeding information back to his family. The attack in the laundry wasn't random, Papa. It was a message. What kind of message? That dead men don't testify in appeals, and that grandfathers who betrayed the family for dead children deserve to die knowing their sacrifice meant nothing. Vinny stared at his daughter, this woman who'd destroyed and saved him in equal measure, and felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Eddie Torino had been playing a longer game than anyone realized. The friendly conversations through the cell walls, the casual questions about family, the seemingly innocent observations about Vinny's mail and visitors. All of it designed to expose the lie that Anthony was still alive. All of it leading to this moment, when Vincent Vinny Cards Marconi would finally understand that his greatest enemy wasn't the Justice Department or rival crime families. It was the man sleeping 3 feet away, separated by concrete and steel, and the kind of patience that turned friendship into a weapon. The revelation settled in Vinny's chest like a tumor. As Sophia's words echoed in the visiting room's silence, he felt the last vestiges of his old self, the grandfather who'd sacrificed everything for love, burning away like paper in a furnace. How long do I have? His voice carried the flat pragmatism of a man calculating odds. Eddie's family expects confirmation within 72 hours, proof that the message was received and understood. Sophia's hands trembled as she closed the legal folder. They want you to know that Anthony died for nothing before they finish what they started in the laundry. Vinny absorbed this with the same detachment he'd once reserved for reading poker tells. Eddie Torino had been patient, cultivating friendship, gathering intelligence, waiting for the perfect moment to twist the knife. But patience was a double-edged weapon in federal prison. It created patterns, routines, vulnerabilities. The guards, Vinny said quietly. Someone's feeding Eddie information from outside. Prison communications don't move that fast without inside help. Papa, listen to me. No. The word cut through Sophia's protest like a blade. You listen. For 18 months I've been playing defense, surviving, accepting, reading the cards I was dealt instead of controlling the deck. He leaned forward, and Sophia flinched at what she saw in his eyes. That ends now. You can't fight them from in there. Eddie has connections, resources. Eddie has assumptions. Vinny's mind was already working, cataloging everything he knew about his cell block neighbor. He thinks he's playing against a broken old man who just discovered his grandson is dead. He's wrong. Sophia's face went pale. What are you planning? I'm planning to remind everyone why they called me Vinny Cards. He paused, studying his daughter's expression with the same intensity he'd once brought to high-stakes games. But first, you're going to tell me who authorized the leak of my cooperation file. I don't know. Wrong answer. Vinny's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Someone in the Justice Department handed Eddie exactly what he needed, exactly when he needed it. That's not a leak. It's orchestration. Who benefits from my death? Sophia's composure cracked further. There are people who want Gotti's conviction overturned. Appeals have been filed. New evidence has surfaced. Your testimony was crucial, but if you're discredited or dead, the case falls apart. Vinny completed the thought with grim satisfaction. And someone in federal law enforcement is betting on Eddie to clean up their mistake. You can't prove that from a supermax cell. I don't need to prove it. Vinny's smile carried no warmth. I just need Eddie to believe it, and I need him to make the first move. The visiting room's intercom crackled to life. Time. Sophia gathered her papers with shaking hands. Papa, whatever you're thinking, be careful. These people destroyed their own investigation to get to you. They won't hesitate to... They already destroyed everything that mattered. Vinny's voice carried finality. Anthony is dead. My family is scattered. My reputation is gone. But there's something they forgot about men who have nothing left to lose. What's that? We're not afraid of dying anymore. We're afraid of dying quietly. As the guards led him back to cell block 7, Vinny's mind raced through possibilities and probabilities. Eddie would be expecting psychological collapse, grief, rage, desperate attempts at revenge that would justify another, more successful attack. Instead, he'd get something Eddie couldn't possibly anticipate, the resurrection of Vincent "Vinny" Cards Marconi, the man who'd run Gotti's empire by understanding that every weakness could become a weapon. The corridor felt different now, charged with potential energy. Each camera, each guard station, each routine procedure became a piece on the chessboard. Eddie had made his greatest mistake, revealing his hand while assuming Vinny was too broken to play. As they approached his cell, Vinny caught a glimpse of Eddie through the neighboring observation slot. His face wore the satisfied expression of a predator watching wounded prey bleed out. The friendly mask had dropped completely, replaced by something cold and calculating. Perfect. Eddie Torino believed he'd destroyed Vincent Marconi's will to fight. He'd revealed the conspiracy, exposed the betrayal, stripped away every illusion that had sustained Vinny through 18 months of federal custody. In Eddie's mind, all that remained was delivering the final blow to a broken grandfather who'd lost everything for nothing. But as Vinny entered his cell and heard the lock engage, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Anthony's diagnosis: absolute clarity. The game had indeed changed, but not in the way Eddie expected. The man who'd testified against John Gotti to save a dying child was gone forever. What remained was something far more dangerous: a federal prisoner with encyclopedic knowledge of criminal operations, intimate understanding of prison dynamics, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Eddie wanted to play psychological warfare? Vinny would teach him the difference between knowing the rules and mastering the game. The first move came at 0200 hours, when most of cell block 7 slept under the watchful eyes of night shift guards. Vinny lay on his narrow bunk, fully dressed, listening to the calculated footsteps approaching his door. Eddie had patience, but grief was supposed to make men reckless. Time to give him what he expected. Eddie? Vinny's voice cracked with manufactured desperation. Eddie, you awake? The footsteps stopped. Through the concrete walls, Vinny heard the subtle shift of weight that meant his neighbor was listening. Yeah, Vinny. I'm here. Eddie's voice carried false sympathy. Rough night? Can't sleep. Keep thinking about what you said, about the medical records, about Sophia lying to me. Vinny let genuine pain bleed into the words, but not the kind Eddie expected. I need to ask you something. What's that? How long have you known? The question hung in the darkness between their cells. About Anthony, about my grandson being dead while I sat here thinking I was saving him. Silence stretched for 30 seconds. Vinny could almost hear Eddie calculating, deciding how much truth to reveal. I suspected for a while, Eddie said finally. Little things, the way your mail stopped coming, the way you never talked about phone calls from the hospital anymore. But I wasn't sure until yesterday. Yesterday. Vinny let the word carry the weight of a man's world collapsing. Someone told you yesterday. Information has a way of traveling, even in here. Vinny rolled off his bunk and pressed his face against the observation slot. In the dim corridor lighting, he could see Eddie's shadow through the neighboring window. The man was wide awake, alert, ready. You know what the worst part is, Vinny whispered. I can't even grieve him properly. Can't visit his grave. Can't make the people responsible pay for what they did. Sometimes that's how it goes. Sometimes the house wins. Wrong answer. Eddie's casual dismissal revealed everything Vinny needed to know about his neighbor's true nature. No grief for a dead child, no sympathy for a grandfather's anguish, just cold satisfaction at a job well done. The house, Vinny repeated. Funny you should mention that, because I've been thinking about houses all night, thinking about the house where Anthony lived, where Sophia lives now, thinking about how certain people might know where to find them. Eddie's shadow shifted. That's dangerous thinking, Vinny. Dangerous for who? Vinny's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity. See, I've been doing math, Eddie. Timestamps and phone calls and coincidences that aren't really coincidences. And you know what I figured out? What's that? You've been talking to your family about me, about my cooperation, about my testimony, about my weakness for dead grandchildren. Vinny paused, letting the words settle. Which means they know about Sophia. The silence that followed lasted exactly 17 seconds. Vinny counted them, reading Eddie's hesitation like cards being dealt face up on a table. You're grieving, Eddie said finally. Making connections that aren't there. Am I? Because here's what I know for certain. Someone leaked my cooperation file to give you leverage. Someone wanted me to know that Anthony died for nothing. And someone is paying you to make sure I don't live to testify in any appeals. Vinny's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. The question is whether you're smart enough to realize you've been set up too. Set up how? Think about it. You're a made man serving federal time, talking to prosecutors about reducing your sentence. How do you think that plays with your own people? Vinny laughed, a sound devoid of humor. They give you my file, tell you to handle the Marconi problem, and when it's done, what happens to the only witness who can prove they ordered the hit? Eddie's breathing changed, becoming shallower. Vinny pressed his advantage. You kill me, you become a liability. You fail to kill me, you become a failure. Either way, you don't walk out of here alive. Vinny stepped back from the observation slot. Unless, of course, you're willing to consider a different game entirely. What kind of game? The kind where we both survive. The kind where the people who killed my grandson and marked us both for death learn what happens when they underestimate federal prisoners with nothing left to lose. Through the walls, Vinny heard Eddie moving around his cell, pacing. The man was calculating odds, weighing options, realizing that the simple contract on Vincent Marconi had become something far more complex. What are you proposing? Vinny smiled in the darkness. Eddie had taken the bait, asked the crucial question that transformed him from hunter to potential ally. The psychological warfare was working exactly as planned. I'm proposing we give them exactly what they want, Vinny said quietly. A dead man who can't testify. You're talking suicide. I'm talking about the resurrection of Vincent Vinny Cards Marconi, and the complete destruction of everyone who thought they could play him for a fool. The game had finally begun. The morning came gray and cold through the single window of cell block 7, casting thin shadows across concrete floors that had witnessed 30 years of broken men. Vinny sat on his bunk, hands folded in his lap, watching dust motes dance in the pale light. For the first time in 18 months, he felt something approaching peace. Eddie Torino had been transferred to protective custody 3 hours ago, carried out on a gurney with 2 broken ribs and a shattered understanding of who he'd been hired to kill. The resurrection of Vincent Vinny Cards Marconi had taken exactly 47 minutes to complete. 47 minutes of psychological warfare that left Eddie begging to confess everything he knew about the conspiracy that reached from the streets of New York to the warden's office of ADX Florence. The game was over. Vinny had won. But victory tasted like ash in his mouth, flavored with the knowledge that Anthony would never know his grandfather had finally fought back. The boy who'd loved stories about cowboys and superheroes had died believing his grandpa Vinny was coming to save him, had died while his grandfather sat in a federal holding cell, trading testimony for medicine that would never arrive. Vinny pressed his palms against his knees and felt the arthritis that had settled into his joints during these long months of captivity. 64 years old, with silver threading through hair that had once been black as coal. The hands that had once shuffled cards with surgeon's precision now trembled slightly in the morning cold. Vincent Vinnie Cards Marconi was an old man who'd outlived his grandson, his honor, and his illusions. The cell door opened with its familiar electronic whine. Marconi. Warden Hayes stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards who kept their hands near their weapons. "You've got visitors." In the visiting room, Sophia sat at the same metal table where she'd shattered his world 48 hours ago. But she wasn't alone. Beside her sat a woman in her 30s with Anthony's dark eyes and Vinny's stubborn chin, his granddaughter Maria, grown from the teenager he remembered into someone who carried herself with familiar determination. "Hello, Grandpa." Maria's voice carried the weight of years and secrets finally surfacing. Vinny took his seat across from them, studying these women who shared his blood and his burden. "How long have you known I was alive?" "Since the beginning," Maria said quietly. "Mom told me everything when I turned 21. About the family business, about your testimony, about why we had to disappear. And you let me think that we were all dead or gone, yes." Sophia's voice carried exhaustion that seemed bone deep. It was safer for everyone if Vincent Marconi had no family left to threaten. Vinny absorbed this final revelation with the same detachment that had carried him through everything else. More lies, more manipulations, more loves twisted into weapons. But looking at Maria, seeing Anthony's eyes in her face, seeing his own determination in the set of her shoulders, he felt something shift inside his chest. "You're a teacher," he said suddenly. The knowledge arriving like a card turned over in his mind. Maria smiled, and for a moment she was 7 years old again, sitting on his lap while he explained why kings were more valuable than jacks. 3rd grade. Same school Anthony would have attended. The present tense hit him like a physical blow. Would have, future conditional, dreams that died with a little boy who'd wanted to grow up to be like his grandfather. "I read to them sometimes," Maria continued. "Stories about brave grandfathers who sacrifice everything to protect their families. About men who face impossible choices and find the strength to do what's right, even when it costs them everything they love." Vinny's vision blurred. "Maria, he knew, Grandpa. At the end, Anthony knew you were fighting for him. Mom told him that his grandfather was the bravest man in the world, that you were facing down bad men to keep him safe." Tears tracked down Maria's cheeks. "He died proud of you." The visiting room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of locked doors. Vinny stared at his hands, these weapons that had dealt cards and counted money and signed testimony that destroyed an empire, and finally allowed himself to grieve. Not for Vincent Vinnie Cards Marconi, the lieutenant who'd read men like poker hands and played every angle to survive. Not for the grandfather who'd sacrificed honor to save a dying child. Not even for the federal prisoner who'd orchestrated one last brilliant game of psychological warfare. He grieved for Anthony, for 7 years cut short, for bedtime stories never told and baseball games never attended, for a little boy who'd believed his grandfather could fix anything, even death. When Vinny finally looked up, Sophia and Maria were watching him with something that might have been forgiveness. "The story's not over," Maria said quietly. "You're still here. Still fighting, still teaching all of us what courage looks like when everything else is gone." Through the reinforced windows, Vinny could see the Colorado mountains rising against a brightening sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay a world where children like Anthony learned about heroes from teachers like Maria, where grandfathers' sacrifices echoed through generations, transforming loss into lessons and pain into purpose. Vincent Vinnie Cards Marconi closed his eyes and finally found peace.